In the dead of night, in a small quiet town, an entire family was slaughtered with an execrance. Children, even visiting guests, no mercy, no escape. The walls of that house dripped with silence and blood, yet no one ever saw the killer leave. More than a century has passed, and still the mystery remains unsolved, haunting every investigator who dared to step inside. Tonight, you are about to enter one of the most terrifying true crime cases in American history, Villisca Axe Murders. A nightmare frozen in time, where the shadows of the killer still seem to breathe through the cracks of that cursed house. Asterisk. It was June 10, 1912, when the small town of Villisca awoke to a nightmare it would never forget. The Moore family lived in a modest white house on East 2nd Street. Josiah Moore, a respected businessman, his wife Sarah, a devoted mother, their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, along with 2 visiting guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger, all went to bed that Sunday night after attending a church program. There was no sign of what was about to unfold, no hint that darkness would soon swallow their lives in a way so brutal that even decades later, people would whisper the name Villisca with unease. The day had been filled with routine comfort. The family attended church services, enjoyed the program with the Stillinger sisters, and walked home through the quiet streets of their small Iowa town. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing gave warning that by dawn their home would be the center of one of the most horrifying and baffling murder cases in American history. As the children drifted to sleep, and Sarah tended to her nightly chores, the house grew silent, while outside the air was warm and still, and the streets of Villisca lay quiet under the pale light of the moon. Sometime after midnight, a figure moved through the Moore home, stealthy, deliberate, almost invisible to the world beyond those walls. What followed was an act so savage it defied explanation. Each member of the household was struck down with the blunt edge of an axe, the blows delivered with a cruelty that seemed to come from deep rage or madness. Josiah received the most vicious of attacks, his head crushed by repeated strikes so forceful that the blade of the weapon scarred the ceiling above his bed. Sarah met a similar fate, followed by each of the children and the Stillinger girls. Every room turned into a chamber of horror, every bed soaked in silence and death. What unsettled investigators even more was the peculiar care the killer seemed to take after the slaughter, as if covering the crime in ritual or shame. Cloths and clothing were used to cover the victims' faces, almost tenderly, though the act itself had been monstrous. Windows were concealed with cloth, items, mirrors draped as if the murderer could not stand to see reflections staring back at him. Food had been left on the kitchen table, untouched. A lamp, with its chimney removed, sat carefully on the floor, casting dim shadows across the rooms. The axe itself was left leaning against a wall, its blade heavy with blood, an object that mocked every eye that would soon fall upon it. By morning, the small town of Villisca awoke to an ordinary day. Neighbors went about their chores, unaware of the horror sealed inside the Moore house. But when a neighbor noticed the unusual stillness, the drawn shades, and the lack of morning activity, worry began to stir. The call went out, and soon what awaited behind the locked doors was discovered. Inside lay the entire Moore family and their 2 guests, lifeless, victims of a night no one had heard unfold. The horror spread quickly across the community. Whispers carried through the streets, and fear rooted itself in the hearts of the townsfolk. The brutality of the crime and the strangeness of its details shocked even the most seasoned lawmen. Investigators from near and far crowded into Villisca, hoping to make sense of the blood-stained puzzle. But nothing could erase the image of 8 victims lying silent in their beds, their lives stolen in the middle of the night without struggle, without witness. The stillness of their deaths suggested an eerie calm, as though the killer had moved like a ghost from room to room, completing his grim work in silence and leaving only questions behind. The Moore family had been respected, loved, part of the very fabric of Villisca. Their sudden end felt like a strike not only against them, but against the soul of the town itself. Neighbors who once trusted each other began to lock their doors at night. The easy rhythm of life was broken. The children who played freely in the streets now kept close to home. The church bells that once rang with comfort seemed to toll with a mournful echo. Fear became the unseen visitor in every house, and the suspicion that a killer walked among them kept the town on edge. Part 1 of this tragedy was not just the murders themselves, but the way the horror seeped into the collective memory of the people of Villisca. Every person who glanced at the White House felt the weight of the silence behind its walls. Every step past the gate carried the reminder of what evil had entered their town. Though the night itself gave no sound, and the killer slipped away like smoke, the shadow of that crime never left. It clung to Villisca with invisible hands, reminding all who lived there that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not found in stories, but in the quiet streets we call home. When investigators arrived, the crime scene shook even the most hardened men. The axe, slick with blood, had been left behind as though mocking those who would come searching for answers. It was not hidden, not discarded in some distant field, but placed in plain sight, leaning casually against the wall as if the killer wanted to taunt whoever walked in next. The house was silent, heavy with death, the curtains still drawn, the mirrors covered, and the air suffocating. Even the officers who had seen death before could not believe what their eyes found inside the Moore home. Theory of a madman came quickly, the kind of stranger who passed through town unseen, leaving only carnage behind. Yet others whispered of a local, someone who knew the Moores, someone who harbored dark secrets and old grudges. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some pointed toward business rivals who resented Josiah Moore's success. Others hinted at jealous lovers, hidden affairs, and bitterness buried deep within the heart of the town. There were even whispers of religious fanaticism, traveling ministers who preached fire and brimstone, warning of God's wrath, men who might have taken their words too literally. But if the killer had been a drifter, how could he have moved with such silence, such purpose, without being seen? And if it was a local, how could he live among his neighbors, walk their streets, and carry such a secret without slipping up? These were the questions that gnawed at the minds of the investigators. The home itself gave strange clues. Every window covered, every face hidden beneath cloth, every mirror concealed. It was as though the killer had been consumed by shame or ritual, or perhaps afraid of spirits reflecting his own crime back at him. Blood spatter stained the walls and ceilings. Marks of the axe cut into the wood above Josiah's bed, so violent were the blows that ended his life. Yet despite the carnage, there was no sign of a struggle. No cries heard through the night, no neighbors awakened by screams. How could 8 people be murdered in their beds without a single sound carrying into the summer air? The thought terrified the townspeople, for it suggested the killer moved like a shadow, like something inhuman, capable of walking from bed to bed in perfect silence, striking without hesitation. Suspicion fell hard and fast. Josiah's former employer, a man who had battled him in business and carried resentment for years, was whispered about in hushed tones. There were those who believed he had the power, the motive, and perhaps even the hired hand to see such a deed carried out. Others looked to strangers who had been seen on the streets of Villisca that weekend, drifters with unfamiliar faces, men who vanished as quickly as they appeared. But for every name suggested, evidence seemed weak, and proof slipped away like smoke. Soon attention turned to a peculiar figure, Reverend George Kelly. He was an itinerant preacher, eccentric, often speaking of visions and strange thoughts. He had attended the very church program the Moores had gone to on the night before their deaths. He had been seen in town, and he seemed fascinated by the case. When news of the murders spread, Kelly left Villisca abruptly, as though fleeing something. Weeks later he would confess in his own unstable way to the crime. Yet his confession unraveled under scrutiny, inconsistent and erratic. He retracted his words, claiming insanity. Some believed he had simply absorbed the details of the crime from newspapers and gossip, convincing himself of a guilt he did not bear. Others believed he truly was the killer, masking his depravity behind the cloak of religion. The trials that followed gripped the town like a fever. Jurors listened, witnesses spoke, and the Reverend's words twisted under pressure. Yet there was never enough to convict, never enough to bring closure. Each mistrial, each failure to secure justice, left Villisca drowning deeper in its mystery. The people of the town, once bound by trust and familiarity, began to fracture. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, old grudges sharpened into accusations, and the shadow of the crime loomed larger than ever. But beyond Kelly, beyond business rivals, beyond wandering strangers, the silence of the crime remained the most chilling clue. How had the killer moved unseen? How had he struck without sound? The axe was heavy, the blows violent, yet none of the children stirred in time to escape. None of the neighbors heard a scream pierce the night. It was as though the house itself had swallowed every cry, as though darkness had wrapped the victims in silence while the murderer walked among them like a phantom. For investigators, it was a puzzle without a solution. The evidence pointed in too many directions, yet in truth, it pointed nowhere at all. The fingerprints found were smudged and useless. The footprints outside the house could belong to anyone. The stories twisted and changed, shaped by gossip and fear. Some swore they saw a stranger lurking on the edge of town. Others insisted the crime was born from jealousy, rooted in the soil of Villisca itself. Yet no one could prove a thing. The murderer's identity remained a ghost, slipping through the hands of justice again and again. The house, meanwhile, became a symbol. It stood silent, its walls holding secrets, its rooms echoing with the memory of that night. People avoided walking past it after dark. Children crossed the street rather than glance at its windows. Visitors to the crime scene swore they felt a heaviness in the air, as though the house itself carried the weight of those 8 souls, as though the walls whispered the truth that no one could hear. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Villisca transformed into a place of paranoia. Locks appeared on doors that had once stood open. Curtains were drawn tightly at dusk. Every stranger was watched, every neighbor questioned in silence. It was no longer just the horror of the crime that haunted Villisca, but the deeper dread that the murderer might still walk its streets, smiling politely, nodding to passers-by, hiding in plain sight, and carrying a secret too terrible to imagine. The investigation that followed was unlike anything the small town had ever seen. Neighbors who had once trusted each other now locked their doors and pulled their children close at night. Whispers of a killer roaming free filled every street, and fear settled over Villisca like a dark cloud that refused to lift. Law enforcement searched desperately for answers, but the evidence was thin, and the crime scene had been trampled by curious townsfolk who entered the Moore home before investigators could properly secure it. In those days, forensic science was still in its infancy. Fingerprints could be taken, but rarely led to convictions. Blood samples could be collected, but there was little that could be done with them. The idea of DNA was decades away from discovery. What investigators had were suspicions, rumors, and a handful of potential suspects, but none of it ever brought them closer to the truth. Suspicion first fell on Frank Jones, a prominent businessman and state senator who had once employed Josiah Moore. Moore had left Jones's company years earlier to start his own business, taking with him a number of key clients. The two men were said to have been bitter rivals ever since, and some believe Jones held a grudge so deep that he might have orchestrated the murders. But while the theory seemed plausible to some, there was never enough evidence to connect him directly to the crime. Others pointed to a traveling minister named Reverend George Kelly. He was a peculiar man, known for his odd behavior and unsettling fascination with the murders. Kelly had attended the church service the Moore family participated in the night before their deaths, and he had even joined the crowd that gathered at the crime scene the next morning. Later he confessed to the killings, but he quickly recanted, claiming he had been pressured by investigators. His confession was filled with inconsistencies, and no physical evidence tied him to the crime. Still, he would remain one of the most infamous suspects in the case. Another theory involved a shadowy figure seen boarding a train the morning after the murders. Some witnesses claimed a man had been spotted leaving town at dawn, carrying a small bag and looking nervous. Could he have been the killer fleeing into the anonymity of the railway system, traveling to another town to start anew, perhaps killing again? No one ever found him, and no name was ever attached to the mysterious man on the train. Investigators struggled with each lead. Every clue seemed to vanish into thin air, and every suspect slipped through their grasp. Weeks turned into months, and still no arrest was made. The townspeople grew restless, and their fear turned to anger. They demanded justice, but justice never came. The murders remained unsolved, and the silence in that house on East 2nd Street grew heavier with each passing year. Time the case became more than just a tragedy. It became a legend, a story that grandparents whispered to children as a warning, a tale that visitors came to Villisca to hear for themselves. The Moore home stood as a grim reminder of the night terror swept through town. Many claimed it was haunted. Strange sounds were heard within its walls, footsteps echoed where no one walked, and voices were said to call out in the dead of night. Paranormal investigators would one day flock to the house, each trying to capture proof of the spirits trapped inside. But back in 1912, it was not about hauntings. It was about grief. It was about 8 coffins lowered into the earth, about a community forever scarred. The investigation dragged on for years with no resolution. Suspects came and went. Trials were held, but ended in acquittals. Slowly the case grew cold. The identity of the murderer slipped further and further away, leaving only questions that time could never answer. Decades passed, and the Villisca Axe Murders never faded from memory. The town grew, families moved on, but the shadow of that bloody night lingered like a curse. The Moore house, once filled with the laughter of children, stood silent and grim, its windows staring out like hollow eyes. People swore the house was alive, that it remembered what had been done inside. Children dared each other to run up the porch steps, but few were brave enough to open the door. Even adults crossed the street to avoid walking too close after sunset. The horror of the murders had outlived every person who had stood in the streets of Villisca that morning in 1912. In the years that followed, new suspects were whispered about, each theory more desperate than the last. Some said a crazed drifter had passed through town that night, murdering at random before disappearing forever into the countryside. Others insisted it had been a local, someone everyone knew, a man who blended in with the crowd and returned to his daily life while carrying the darkest secret imaginable. Without forensic evidence, the case could never move forward. Investigators grew old, files gathered dust, and the truth slipped away like smoke in the wind. The legend of the house grew stronger with each passing decade. Visitors came from across the country, drawn by curiosity and fear. Paranormal investigators brought cameras, recorders, and night vision equipment, hoping to capture proof of the restless souls still trapped inside. Some claimed they heard children's voices giggling in the darkness. Others said they felt cold hands brush against their arms, or saw shadowy figures standing in the corners of the rooms. More than one guest swore they woke in the night to see a man with an axe standing silently at the foot of their bed. The house fed on these stories, and with every retelling, the horror deepened. But beyond the ghost tales and whispered hauntings lay the true heart of the tragedy. 8 lives were stolen in a single night, and no one was ever held accountable. Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 innocent children, and 2 young girls who had simply been guests, all lost to a killer's rage. The families left behind carried wounds that time could never heal. Parents buried children, siblings buried siblings, and a community buried its sense of safety forever. The murders were not just a mystery. They were a scar carved deep into the soul of Villisca. The case still fascinates historians and crime researchers. Books have been written, documentaries filmed, and theories debated endlessly. Some insist Reverend Kelly was the true killer, pointing to his unstable behavior and eventual confession. Others argue Frank Jones had motive and power enough to order the crime, though he never lifted an axe himself. A few even claim the murders were part of a larger string of similar crimes that swept across the Midwest at the time, suggesting a serial killer whose identity was never discovered. Yet after more than a century, none of these theories have ever been proven. The killer's name remains unknown. What remains is the house itself, standing stubbornly against time, its wooden walls soaked with sorrow. Visitors still report strange sensations the moment they step inside. Some feel an overwhelming sadness. Others feel anger pressing down on them like a weight. The walls seem to whisper, the floors seem to breathe, and the silence is so heavy it feels alive. Whether haunted by spirits or haunted by memory, the house holds the darkness of that night within it. It has become a monument to unanswered questions and unending grief. The Villisca Axe Murders will likely never be solved. The evidence is gone, the witnesses are long dead, and the truth is buried beneath layers of time and silence. What endures is the story, a grim reminder that evil can strike without warning, and that sometimes justice never comes. For the people of Villisca, the house is more than just a crime scene. It is a reminder of the fragility of safety, the cruelty of fate, and the fact that behind every locked door there still lingers the possibility of darkness. And so the Moore-house stands, quiet yet screaming, empty yet crowded with echoes of the past. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the cracks, feels like the memory of that night calling out across the years. Visitors leave with chills, some with nightmares, others with questions they cannot shake. The story has become more than just history. It has become legend. The house is a tomb without peace, a story without an ending, and a mystery that will forever haunt not just Villisca, but anyone who dares to step inside. The Villisca Axe Murder mystery will always remain one of the darkest unsolved crimes in American history. A story where 8 lives ended in silence, where justice was never served, and where a town was forever marked by terror. The house still waits, holding its secrets, daring the world to remember what happened on that terrible night in 1912. Perhaps the answers are gone forever. Perhaps the killer's identity lies buried in an unmarked grave. Or perhaps the house itself will one day whisper the truth to those who are willing to listen. Until then, the Villisca Axe Murder remains not just unsolved, but unforgettable.